Humanity has always told its story through the ruins it leaves behind. Long before our modern world took shape, vast civilizations rose from dust, carved their names into stone, and believed, with absolute certainty, that their order would endure forever. They built cities aligned with the stars, raised monuments meant to outlive time itself, and created systems so complex that they appeared unbreakable. Yet today, many of those worlds exist only as fragments buried beneath sand and silence. What makes this pattern so unsettling is not simply that civilizations fall, it is that nearly every great civilization believed it would be the exception. From the first cities of Mesopotamia to the monumental kingdoms of Egypt, from the restless brilliance of Greece to the iron machinery of Rome, each society carried the same quiet conviction that its power was stable, its structure permanent, and its future secure. And yet, history tells a colder story. Again and again, complexity turned into rigidity, confidence into blindness, and strength into vulnerability. This raises a deeper and more uncomfortable question. Were these collapses truly caused by external enemies, natural disasters, or economic strain? Or did the seeds of decline exist within the civilizations themselves from the very beginning? Because when we look closely, a pattern begins to emerge, one that repeats across continents and centuries. Civilizations rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they erode slowly, almost invisibly, while daily life appears normal on the surface. Markets still open, armies still march, leaders still speak with confidence, and the population, more often than not, continues to believe that stability will somehow hold, until it doesn't. What makes this cycle so powerful and so dangerous is the psychology behind it. Great systems do not usually fail because people see the danger too late. They fail because people become accustomed to the very conditions that signal decline. Comfort dulls alarm. Success breeds overconfidence. And institutions that once created strength gradually become too rigid to adapt when the world begins to shift. In many ways, the story of ancient civilizations is not only about the past, it is also a mirror reflecting patterns of human behavior that continue to shape societies today. The technologies have changed, the borders have moved, but the underlying dynamics of power, belief, adaptation, and denial remain strikingly familiar. So in this journey, we are not simply revisiting dead empires. We are examining the hidden mechanics of how complex human systems rise, stabilize, and eventually begin to fracture from within. We will move through the world of the first city builders, the architects of divine kingship, the birthplaces of philosophy and democracy, and the engineers of the most formidable empire the ancient world had ever seen. But more importantly, we will trace the quiet signals that appeared long before each civilization reached its breaking point. Because history rarely whispers its warnings loudly, and the most dangerous moment for any civilization may be the moment it feels most secure. Welcome to the enigmatic veil. When we look across the long arc of history, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Civilizations do not rise by accident. Beneath every great empire, every monumental city, and every enduring culture lies a foundation built from a small set of powerful forces. These forces appear again and again, whether in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the floodplains of the Nile, the rugged coasts of Greece, or the vast road networks of Rome. Geography, resources, social organization, belief systems, and trade routes. Together, they form the hidden architecture of civilization itself. Geography is always the silent beginning. Long before laws are written or armies assembled, the land itself shapes what is possible. Rivers provide not only water, but predictability. Mountains offer protection, but also isolation. Open plains invite expansion but expose societies to invasion. The earliest civilizations did not emerge randomly. They appeared in places where geography offered a fragile but powerful advantage. Yet geography is a double-edged force. The same river that nourishes agriculture can flood and destroy. The same natural barriers that protect a culture can also trap it in strategic complacency. Over time, many civilizations begin to mistake geographic fortune for permanent security. And history shows how dangerous that illusion can become. But geography alone is never enough. Resources determine whether a society can transform opportunity into power. Fertile soil feeds populations, metals forge tools and weapons, timber builds fleets, and surplus production allows specialization. When resources are abundant and well managed, societies expand rapidly, cities grow, bureaucracies form, culture flourishes. However, the management of resources often plants the first seeds of long-term instability. Overexploitation, unequal distribution, and dependence on fragile supply systems can slowly undermine even the most prosperous states. Many great powers did not collapse when resources first became strained. They collapsed when their systems could no longer adapt to the strain. As populations grow and complexity increases, social organization becomes the next decisive factor. No civilization survives long without a structure that coordinates labor, enforces rules, and manages conflict. Early on, flexible and responsive institutions tend to fuel rapid growth, but success carries a hidden cost. Systems that once enabled expansion often harden over time. Hierarchies become rigid, bureaucracies multiply, elites distance themselves from the realities of the broader population. What once functioned as an engine of order gradually transforms into a mechanism of inertia. History repeatedly shows that the most dangerous moment for a complex society is not when its institutions are weak, but when they are too rigid to change. Yet even structure and material wealth do not fully explain the endurance of civilizations. Beneath laws and economies lies something less visible but equally powerful: belief systems. Every enduring civilization develops a shared framework that explains the world, justifies authority, and binds the population into a common psychological reality. In ancient Egypt, divine kingship fused cosmic order with political power. In Rome, civic identity and imperial destiny created a powerful sense of collective purpose. Belief systems reduce uncertainty and create cohesion, but they also introduce risk. When a society's core beliefs become too tightly fused with its institutions, adaptation becomes psychologically difficult. Warning signs are ignored. Dissent is reframed as disloyalty, and by the time reality forces change, the system often lacks the flexibility to respond. Finally, no civilization exists in isolation. Trade routes act as the circulatory system of the ancient world, moving not only goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural influences across vast distances. Control of trade can generate immense wealth and strategic advantage. It can transform regional powers into global ones. But connectivity also introduces vulnerability. The more complex and interdependent trade networks become, the more exposed a civilization is to disruption, whether from conflict, environmental shifts, or internal instability. Many societies reached their peak precisely when their networks were most expansive and most fragile. When we step back and view these forces together, a pattern begins to emerge. Civilizations rise when geography offers opportunity. Resources are abundant, social systems remain adaptive, belief structures unify rather than blind, and trade networks expand without becoming dangerously overextended. But over time, the balance shifts. Advantages harden into assumptions. Flexibility gives way to rigidity. Confidence slowly transforms into systemic blindness. Mesopotamia, the first cities long before empires stretched across continents, before marble temples crowned distant capitals, and before history was carved into monumental stone, there was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here, in the fertile plains shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity crossed one of its most important thresholds. For the first time in recorded history, scattered human communities began to gather, concentrate, and organize themselves into something entirely new: the city. This transformation did not happen overnight. For thousands of years, human groups had lived in small, mobile communities, adapting constantly to the rhythms of nature. But Mesopotamia offered a rare and powerful opportunity. The rivers flooded seasonally, depositing rich layers of fertile soil. With careful irrigation and coordinated labor, agriculture could produce reliable surpluses. And surplus, more than any single invention, is what made civilization possible. Once food production exceeded immediate survival needs, human society began to change in profound ways. Populations grew, labor specialized. Some people farmed, others built, others administered, and others recorded. Gradually, the first true urban centers emerged, places like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash. These were not merely large villages. They were complex organisms, dense with hierarchy, coordination, and emerging systems of control. Uruk, in particular, stands as one of the earliest and most striking examples of this transformation. By around 3000 BCE, it had grown into a sprawling urban landscape with monumental architecture, organized districts, and one of humanity's most revolutionary inventions: writing. What began as simple accounting marks on clay tablets evolved into cuneiform, a system that allowed information, laws, transactions, and eventually stories to outlive the human voice. Writing did more than preserve memory. It changed power itself. For the first time, authority could be recorded, standardized, and projected across distance and time. Bureaucracy was born. Administration became more precise. Control became more scalable. And with each layer of complexity, Mesopotamian cities grew more sophisticated, but also more structurally fragile, because the rise of the first cities brought with it a new kind of pressure. Dense populations required constant resource management. Irrigation systems demanded coordination and maintenance. Food surpluses had to be protected, stored, and redistributed. Social hierarchies deepened. Elites emerged. Priesthoods gained influence. Kingship began to crystallize. What had once been flexible human communities were slowly transforming into tightly managed systems. And with this transformation came a psychological shift that would echo throughout all later civilizations. The city created not only physical concentration, but mental centralization. People began to see order as something constructed, something that required constant oversight and authority. The idea that stability depended on structured control took root here, in the mud brick cities of Mesopotamia. Yet even at its height, the Mesopotamian world carried within it the seeds of long-term vulnerability. The same irrigation that fed the fields gradually increased soil salinity in some regions. Competition between neighboring city-states led to near-constant conflict. Political authority often shifted violently. Environmental stress, warfare, and internal strain created cycles of rise and decline that repeated across centuries. No single collapse ended Mesopotamian civilization. Instead, it experienced waves of fragmentation, consolidation, and renewal. This pattern is crucial because Mesopotamia teaches us that civilization does not simply rise and fall in one clean arc. It pulses, it strains, it adapts until adaptation becomes harder than maintaining the illusion of stability. In many ways, the first cities achieved something extraordinary. They proved that humans could build complex, enduring systems capable of organizing tens of thousands of people. They created writing, formal law, large-scale administration, and urban life itself. But they also revealed a truth that would follow every great civilization that came after them. The more complex a system becomes, the more carefully it must balance control with flexibility. And in the quiet streets of the world's first cities, that delicate balance was already being tested. The birth of the first cities marked one of the most profound turning points in human history. For tens of thousands of years, human beings had lived in small, mobile groups, their survival tied closely to the rhythms of the natural world. But in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, something irreversible began to unfold. Small agricultural settlements, once scattered and loosely organized, started to cluster, expand, and densify. Over generations, these settlements crossed an invisible threshold and became the world's first true cities. This transformation was not simply about population size. It represented a fundamental change in how human societies functioned. In early villages, social relationships were mostly personal and direct. Authority was limited, and daily life was shaped by immediate necessity. But cities introduced scale, and scale demanded structure. As urban populations grew into the tens of thousands, informal cooperation was no longer enough. Systems of administration, labor coordination, food storage, and security had to become more sophisticated and more centralized. Uruk stands as one of the earliest and most striking examples of this new urban reality. By the late 4th millennium BCE, it had evolved into a dense and highly organized city, complete with monumental temple complexes, specialized districts, and a growing administrative class. What made Uruk revolutionary was not only its size, but the new kind of thinking it required. For the first time, human communities had to manage complexity on a scale never before attempted. And it was precisely this pressure, the need to track goods, labor, and obligations, that gave birth to one of humanity's most transformative inventions, writing. At first, writing was not poetry or philosophy. It was accounting. Early administrators in Mesopotamia faced a practical problem. As agricultural surplus increased and trade networks expanded, keeping track of grain shipments, livestock counts, and labor contributions became increasingly difficult. Memory alone was no longer reliable. Spoken agreements could be disputed. And in a system growing more complex by the year, uncertainty was dangerous. The solution emerged gradually. Simple clay tokens were first used to represent quantities of goods. Over time, these evolved into markings pressed onto wet clay tablets, pictographic symbols that could record transactions with far greater precision. By around 3200 BCE, these markings developed into what we now call cuneiform writing. This moment cannot be overstated, because writing did not merely record civilization, it accelerated it. Once information could be preserved outside the human mind, administration became more powerful and more scalable. Laws could be standardized, taxes could be tracked, authority could extend beyond immediate personal oversight. Knowledge could accumulate across generations rather than being lost with each passing lifetime. But writing also introduced a quieter, more subtle shift in human society. It created distance between power and people. Where earlier communities relied heavily on face-to-face trust and oral tradition, written systems allowed control to become more abstract and more institutional. Orders could be issued from afar. Records could define obligations impersonally. Bureaucracy, the quiet machinery of complex states, began to take shape. In many ways, the first cities and the first writing systems were born together because they solved the same problem: complexity. Cities concentrated people. Writing concentrated information. And together, they made large-scale civilization possible. Yet they also introduced new vulnerabilities that would echo throughout history. As systems grew more intricate, they became harder to adapt quickly. As administration expanded, societies became more dependent on stable institutions. And as authority became more formalized, the gap between rulers and the ruled slowly widened. What began in the mud brick cities of Mesopotamia was not just urban life as we know it. It was the beginning of a new human condition, one defined by organized complexity, recorded memory, and systems powerful enough to outlive the individuals who built them. And from that moment forward, history would never move slowly again. As the first cities expanded and populations grew denser, a new problem began to emerge, one that no amount of agriculture or architecture alone could solve. Complexity brings friction, and friction left unmanaged leads to instability. In the crowded urban environments of Mesopotamia, disputes over land, trade, labor, and social status became increasingly common. Informal customs and personal mediation were no longer sufficient to maintain order among tens of thousands of people who often had no direct relationship with one another. Out of this pressure, the earliest formal legal systems began to take shape. At first, law was closely intertwined with religious authority. Priests and temple institutions often served as arbiters of disputes, framing decisions as reflections of divine will. This gave early legal judgments a powerful legitimacy. Order was no longer just socially expected, it was cosmically sanctioned. But as cities grew more complex and political leadership became more centralized, law gradually evolved from primarily sacred guidance into a more structured instrument of governance. The most famous expression of this shift appears in the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest surviving comprehensive legal codes. Carved into stone and publicly displayed, it represented something profoundly new in human society. The idea that rules could be fixed, visible, and theoretically applied across an entire population. Justice was no longer entirely personal or situational. It was becoming standardized. This development brought clear advantages. Predictable rules reduced uncertainty. Trade became more reliable. Property rights could be enforced. Administrative control became more efficient. In many ways, formal law was one of the key technologies that allowed early states to scale beyond small, kin-based communities. But embedded within this progress was a deeper transformation. Law also became a tool of power consolidation. As legal systems grew more elaborate, they increasingly reflected and reinforced the existing social hierarchy. Penalties were often stratified by class. Elites enjoyed protections that common laborers did not. The language of justice created an appearance of universal order, but in practice, it often stabilized unequal power structures. This dual nature of early law, both stabilizing and stratifying, would become a recurring pattern across civilizations. Alongside the formalization of law came another critical shift: the centralization of power. In the earliest phases of urban life, authority in Mesopotamian cities was somewhat distributed between temple institutions, local leaders, and emerging political figures. But over time, the pressures of warfare, large-scale irrigation management, and inter-city competition favored more concentrated leadership. The figure of the king, once limited, began to expand in scope and authority. Centralization offered undeniable short-term advantages. Decisions could be made more quickly. Large infrastructure projects could be coordinated more effectively. Armies could be mobilized with greater efficiency. In periods of external threat or internal strain, a strong central authority often appeared to be the most reliable path to stability. Yet history repeatedly reveals the long-term tension within centralized systems. The more power concentrates at the top, the more the system depends on the clarity, competence, and adaptability of a relatively small decision-making core. Feedback from the broader population becomes filtered. Local conditions become harder to perceive accurately from the center. Bureaucracies, once designed to improve efficiency, can begin to prioritize self-preservation over responsiveness. In Mesopotamia, this dynamic appeared early and often. Periods of strong centralized rule frequently alternated with fragmentation and regional autonomy. Empires formed, expanded, strained under their own administrative weight, and then fractured, only to be rebuilt again in new configurations. This pattern matters because the birth of legal systems and the centralization of power were not isolated administrative innovations. They were foundational shifts in how human societies managed scale, conflict, and complexity. They made large civilizations possible. They enabled coordination on a level previously unimaginable. But they also introduced structural tensions that would follow every major civilization that came after. The very mechanisms that created order would, over centuries, quietly increase the risk of rigidity. And in the long arc of history, rigidity has often proven to be far more dangerous than disorder. Ancient Egypt, order against chaos. If Mesopotamia represents the restless birth of urban complexity, ancient Egypt represents something very different, a civilization built on the relentless pursuit of order. Along the narrow, life-giving ribbon of the Nile River, Egyptian society developed one of the most stable and enduring political systems in the ancient world. For thousands of years, while other regions experienced repeated cycles of fragmentation and conflict, Egypt projected an image of continuity, balance, and cosmic harmony. This was not accidental. Egyptian civilization was shaped by a powerful and deeply internalized idea, the eternal struggle between order and chaos. In Egyptian thought, this balance was expressed through the concept of ma'at, the principle of truth, harmony, stability, and rightful order that governed both the universe and human society. Maintaining ma'at was not merely a political goal, it was a cosmic responsibility, and at the center of that responsibility stood the pharaoh. Unlike many other ancient rulers, the Egyptian pharaoh was not simply a political leader. He was understood as the living guarantor of cosmic balance, a bridge between the human world and the divine order of the universe. This fusion of political authority and sacred legitimacy created one of the most powerful stabilizing mechanisms in early history. Obedience was not framed merely as loyalty to a ruler. It was framed as participation in maintaining the balance of existence itself. This belief system produced extraordinary results. Egyptian society achieved remarkable continuity across millennia. Monumental architecture such as the pyramids and vast temple complexes demonstrated an unparalleled capacity for coordinated labor and long-term planning. Agricultural production along the Nile's predictable flood cycles supported a relatively stable population. Administrative systems became highly refined. Compared to the near-constant volatility of Mesopotamian city-states, Egypt appeared almost timeless. But beneath this remarkable stability lay a subtle and growing vulnerability, because systems built around the preservation of order often become increasingly resistant to necessary change. The very success of Egyptian stability created a psychological and institutional preference for continuity over adaptation. When a civilization defines its highest virtue as maintaining balance, any significant structural reform can begin to feel not merely risky but dangerous, even sacrilegious. Over long stretches of time, this dynamic produced what might be called stability rigidity. Egyptian institutions became highly effective at preserving established patterns, but less flexible when confronted with unfamiliar pressures. Periods such as the First Intermediate Period and later the Late Bronze Age disruptions revealed moments when the carefully maintained equilibrium could fracture under environmental stress, economic strain, or political fragmentation. Yet even during periods of weakness, the Egyptian system showed an extraordinary capacity for restoration. Time and again, central authority reconstituted itself, and the ideology of Ma'at reasserted its psychological hold over the population. This resilience is one of the most remarkable features of Egyptian civilization, and also one of its most revealing, because ancient Egypt demonstrates a critical truth about complex societies. Extreme instability is dangerous, but extreme stability carries its own hidden risks. When a system becomes deeply optimized for preserving order, it may gradually lose its ability to respond creatively to unexpected change. Warning signs can be interpreted as temporary disturbances rather than structural threats. Elites invested in continuity may underestimate emerging pressures, and populations accustomed to long periods of predictability may struggle to recognize the early signals of systemic strain. In this sense, Egypt's long endurance was both its greatest achievement and its most subtle constraint. It proved that human societies could maintain large-scale order across centuries, something Mesopotamia struggled to achieve consistently. But it also revealed that the pursuit of perfect stability can, over very long time horizons, narrow a civilization's adaptive flexibility. And as later history would show again and again, the civilizations that endure the longest are not always the ones that remain strongest forever. Sometimes, they are simply the ones that take longer to realize the balance has begun to shift. At the very heart of ancient Egypt's extraordinary stability stood one of the most powerful political innovations in human history, the pharaonic system. Unlike many early rulers who derived authority primarily from military strength or elite consensus, the Egyptian pharaoh occupied a far more elevated position. He was not merely a king who ruled by divine favor. He was understood to be divine himself, the living embodiment of cosmic order on earth. This distinction mattered profoundly, because when political authority is framed as human, it can be questioned, negotiated, or resisted. But when authority is framed as sacred and cosmically necessary, obedience transforms from a political act into a moral and spiritual obligation. In Egypt, loyalty to the pharaoh was inseparable from loyalty to Ma'at, the universal principle of balance, truth, and order. To challenge the ruler was not simply to challenge the state, it was to risk participating in cosmic disorder. The architecture of Egyptian power reflected this fusion at every level. Monumental temples, vast mortuary complexes, and the carefully orchestrated rituals of kingship continuously reinforced the pharaoh's unique status. Through art, inscription, and ceremony, the ruler was depicted not as distant from the gods, but as part of their continuum, the indispensable human anchor of divine stability. This system created one of the most psychologically effective forms of centralized authority the ancient world had ever seen. Because divine kingship solved a critical problem that many early states struggled with: legitimacy at scale. In large, complex societies, rulers must convince vast populations, many of whom will never see the ruler directly, that the existing order is natural, necessary, and beneficial. Egypt achieved this not primarily through constant coercion, but through a deeply internalized belief structure. The population did not simply obey the pharaoh out of fear. Many obeyed because the system made obedience feel cosmically correct. However, the very strength of this model contained an important structural tension. When authority is heavily personalized and sacralized, the stability of the entire system becomes closely tied to the perceived strength and competence of the ruler. Strong pharaohs could reinforce unity, coordinate massive projects, and maintain the illusion of eternal order. But periods of weak leadership exposed the system's underlying fragility. Without the full psychological weight of a commanding divine figure, administrative coherence could begin to loosen. Regional elites could grow more autonomous, and the carefully maintained image of unbreakable order could start to crack. This dynamic became especially visible during Egypt's intermediate periods, when central authority weakened and the ideological aura surrounding kingship temporarily dimmed. These moments reveal an important truth about highly centralized sacred systems. Their greatest strength, unified legitimacy, can also become their greatest vulnerability when continuity is disrupted. Yet for remarkable stretches of time, the Egyptian model worked with extraordinary effectiveness. The fusion of divine authority, bureaucratic administration, agricultural predictability, and cultural continuity produced one of the longest-lasting state structures in the ancient world. Few civilizations maintained such a strong sense of civilizational identity across millennia, and still, beneath the surface of this apparent permanence, the same quiet question lingered, one that echoes across many complex societies in history. What happens when a system becomes so committed to preserving order that it becomes less able to recognize when the world around it is beginning to change? In ancient Egypt, the pharaonic system demonstrated the immense stabilizing power of sacred authority, but it also offered an early glimpse into a recurring historical pattern. When political legitimacy becomes deeply intertwined with cosmic certainty, adaptation can become psychologically difficult. And over very long stretches of time, even the most divinely sanctioned systems must eventually confront the reality that order, no matter how carefully maintained, is never truly permanent. One of the most striking psychological features of ancient Egypt was its deep and persistent obsession with stability. While many neighboring civilizations experienced frequent political upheaval, shifting city alliances, and rapid institutional change, Egypt developed a civilizational mindset that placed extraordinary value on continuity. Stability was not simply desirable, it was sacred. The preservation of order was seen as the highest collective responsibility, woven into religion, governance, and daily life. This obsession did not emerge randomly. It was reinforced constantly through the ideology of Ma'at, the divine principle of balance and cosmic harmony. Every successful Nile flood, every orderly succession of power, every completed harvest cycle appeared to confirm the same reassuring message: the system was working. Over generations, this produced a powerful psychological feedback loop. The longer stability persisted, the more natural and permanent it began to feel. But civilizations rarely express their deepest values only through words. They express them through stone. Nowhere is Egypt's stability mindset more visible than in its monumental architecture. The pyramids, vast temple complexes, colossal statues, and carefully aligned necropolises were not merely displays of wealth or engineering skill. They were physical declarations of permanence. Each massive structure communicated the same quiet message across the landscape: this order is eternal, this power is immovable, this civilization will endure. Monumental building projects served multiple functions at once. They demonstrated the state's capacity to mobilize labor on an enormous scale. They reinforced the divine legitimacy of the pharaoh. They created shared cultural symbols that unified the population across generations. And perhaps most importantly, they materialized the idea of permanence in a world that was otherwise unpredictable. Stone does something psychologically powerful. Unlike wood or mud, it resists time. It suggests continuity beyond the human lifespan. By building in stone at such massive scale, Egyptian rulers were not only constructing tombs and temples, they were constructing confidence. They were embedding the expectation of endurance directly into the physical environment of the civilization. Yet this is where the deeper historical tension begins to surface, because the more a civilization invests emotionally, politically, and economically in projecting permanence, the more difficult it can become to recognize signs of necessary change. Monumental systems often create monumental inertia. Resources flow toward preservation. Institutions become optimized for maintaining the existing order. Elites grow accustomed to continuity, and over long periods, flexibility, the quiet engine of long-term survival, can begin to erode. This leads us to a powerful and somewhat uncomfortable thesis. The civilizations that appear most stable on the surface are often the ones most heavily invested in the illusion of permanence. Ancient Egypt did not collapse because its system was weak. For much of its history, it was extraordinarily effective. Its agricultural base was reliable. Its administrative structures were sophisticated. Its ideological cohesion was remarkably strong. But over centuries, the same mechanisms that preserved order also narrowed the system's adaptive range. When environmental stress increased, when foreign pressures intensified, or when internal fragmentation emerged, the deeply ingrained expectation of continuity made rapid structural change psychologically and institutionally difficult. Stability had become not just a strength, but a habit, and habits, when conditions shift, can become liabilities. In this way, Egypt offers one of history's clearest demonstrations of a recurring civilizational paradox. The drive to make order permanent can produce extraordinary endurance. But the stronger the illusion of permanence becomes, the harder it is for a system to recognize the moment when adaptation is no longer optional. And in the long arc of history, that moment has arrived for more civilizations than any of them ever expected. Ancient Greece, the birth of thought. If Egypt mastered the art of preserving order, ancient Greece introduced something far more unpredictable into human history: the systematic questioning of reality itself. Scattered across rugged coastlines, mountainous peninsulas, and island networks, the Greek world never formed a single unified empire in its early phases. Instead, it developed as a constellation of independent city-states, each experimenting, competing, and evolving in relative proximity. And from this fragmented landscape emerged one of the most transformative developments in human civilization: the birth of critical thought. Geography played a subtle but decisive role in this shift. Unlike the centralized river civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, Greece's broken terrain made large-scale political unification difficult. Valleys were isolated by mountains. Communities developed strong local identities. Trade flowed across the Mediterranean, exposing Greek societies to a wide range of foreign ideas and cultural influences. This environment rewarded adaptability, debate, and experimentation rather than rigid continuity. Over time, a remarkable intellectual culture began to take shape. In the marketplaces of Athens, in the academies of philosophers, and in the competitive political assemblies of the polis, Greeks developed a habit that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western thought. They asked why. Not only why crops failed or why enemies attacked, but why the universe functioned as it did, why laws should be obeyed, why justice mattered, and why human beings behaved the way they did. This shift from myth-based explanation toward rational inquiry did not happen instantly, nor did it fully replace traditional belief systems, but it introduced a new cognitive posture into civilization. Reality was no longer only something to be accepted or preserved. It became something to be examined, debated, and, in some cases, challenged. The emergence of early philosophers marked a critical turning point. Thinkers began searching for underlying principles that governed nature and society. Some looked to mathematics and geometry. Others examined ethics, politics, and the structure of knowledge itself. The famous method of relentless questioning, later associated with Socratic dialogue, reflected a deeper cultural transformation. Authority, while still powerful, was no longer completely insulated from intellectual scrutiny. This intellectual awakening produced extraordinary cultural energy. Greek city-states generated advances in philosophy, drama, political theory, science, and art that would echo across millennia. The concept of citizenship evolved. Early forms of participatory governance appeared in places like Athens. Public debate became a central feature of political life. But the Greek achievement also carried a structural tension that history would reveal repeatedly. The same environment that fostered creativity also intensified competition and fragmentation. Independent city-states developed strong internal identities, but struggled to maintain lasting unity. Alliances shifted, rivalries deepened. Periods of cooperation were often followed by devastating conflicts, most notably the Peloponnesian War, which exhausted many of the most powerful Greek polities. This pattern highlights an important civilizational trade-off. Societies that encourage open inquiry and decentralized political energy often generate remarkable bursts of innovation, but they may also face greater difficulty maintaining long-term, large-scale cohesion, especially when external pressures mount. Ancient Greece did not fail because it lacked brilliance. In many respects, it was one of the most intellectually dynamic cultures the world had ever seen. Its ideas would profoundly shape later Roman governance, Renaissance thought, and modern philosophical traditions. But its political fragmentation made sustained unified power difficult to maintain. In this sense, Greece revealed another recurring historical dynamic. Extreme stability can produce rigidity, but extreme dynamism can produce fragmentation, and the long story of civilization often unfolds in the unstable space between those two forces, between the desire to preserve order and the equally powerful impulse to question it. With ancient Greece, humanity crossed a new threshold. For the first time at scale, a civilization began to systematically examine not just how the world worked, but whether the structures governing human life were justified at all. And once that question enters history, it never fully disappears. At the core of ancient Greece's unique development stood the polis, the city-state, one of the most influential political inventions in human history. Unlike the vast, centralized empires of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Greek world evolved into a mosaic of relatively small, self-governing communities. Each polis functioned as an independent political organism, complete with its own laws, institutions, military forces, and civic identity. This structure fundamentally reshaped how power, citizenship, and political participation were understood. The polis was not simply a physical city surrounded by walls. It was a deeply embedded social contract. To belong to a polis was to participate, at least in theory, in its collective life. Citizens were expected to serve in the military, engage in public debate, and contribute to the political process. This level of civic involvement created a new psychological relationship between individuals and the state. Authority was no longer exclusively distant and divine. It became, in certain contexts, something negotiated within the community itself. Among the many polis, Athens developed one of the most historically consequential experiments: early democracy. The Athenian system did not emerge fully formed. It evolved gradually through a series of reforms that redistributed political power away from purely aristocratic control. Assemblies expanded, legal procedures became more formalized. Mechanisms were introduced that allowed broader segments of the male citizen population to participate in decision-making. For the first time at significant scale, Governance was framed not solely as the domain of kings or narrow elites, but as a collective civic responsibility. This innovation produced profound effects. Public debate became institutionalized. Political persuasion became a central skill. Laws were increasingly framed as products of civic consensus rather than purely imposed authority. The psychological distance between the governed and the governing body narrowed in ways rarely seen in earlier civilizations. However, the Athenian democracy carried important limitations that must be understood clearly. Participation was restricted primarily to free adult male citizens. Women, enslaved people, and large segments of the population remained excluded from political power. In practice, the democratic system rested on a relatively narrow civic base. Yet even with these constraints, the conceptual breakthrough was enormous. For the first time, large numbers of citizens experienced governance not merely as something done to them, but as something done by them. This shift introduced both remarkable strengths and subtle vulnerabilities. On one hand, the police system fostered intense civic engagement, rapid innovation in political thought, and a strong sense of local identity. Citizens who felt invested in the political process often demonstrated high levels of participation and military commitment. Public accountability mechanisms such as ostracism and open assemblies created new ways to manage leadership risk. On the other hand, the same participatory dynamism could produce volatility. Public opinion could shift quickly. Charismatic speakers could influence large assemblies. Rival polis competed fiercely, and the lack of sustained large-scale political unity left the Greek world vulnerable to prolonged internal conflict. The Peloponnesian War exposed many of these tensions. Democratic Athens and oligarchic Sparta, along with their respective allies, became locked in a prolonged and exhausting struggle that weakened the broader Greek system. Political experimentation had generated extraordinary intellectual and cultural vitality, but it had not solved the enduring problem of stable, large-scale coordination. This reveals another recurring pattern in the history of complex societies. The diffusion of political participation can unleash tremendous creative and civic energy, but without durable mechanisms for long-term cohesion, highly competitive political ecosystems can drift toward fragmentation and internal strain. Ancient Greece did not leave behind a single unified empire in its classical period. Instead, it left something arguably more influential, a political and philosophical legacy that would shape how later civilizations thought about citizenship, governance, and the legitimacy of power. The polis and the early democratic experiments of Athens did not perfect political order, but they permanently changed the questions human societies would ask about it. And once populations begin to see power as something that can be debated, distributed, and contested, the structure of civilization itself becomes far more dynamic and far less predictable. As the political experiments of the Greek city-states matured, something even more transformative began to unfold, a true explosion of philosophical inquiry. What had started as scattered curiosity about nature and the cosmos evolved into one of the most concentrated periods of intellectual development in human history. Within a relatively short span of centuries, Greek thinkers began systematically questioning not only the physical world, but the foundations of ethics, knowledge, governance, and human purpose itself. This philosophical surge did not emerge in isolation. It was deeply connected to the social environment of the polis system. In cities like Athens, public debate was normalized. Competing schools of thought coexisted in close proximity. Teachers, rhetoricians, mathematicians, and philosophers operated in a culture that increasingly valued argument, persuasion, and intellectual distinction. The absence of a single, unchallenged ideological authority created fertile ground for conceptual experimentation. Thinkers began to ask increasingly dangerous questions. What is justice, really? What makes a law legitimate? Is power naturally just or merely enforced? Can truth be discovered through reason alone? These were not merely abstract exercises. They quietly reshaped how segments of Greek society understood authority itself. When individuals begin examining the foundations of law, morality, and political legitimacy, the psychological stability of any system becomes more complex to maintain. The flowering of philosophy brought extraordinary achievements. Advances in logic, ethics, political theory, mathematics, and natural philosophy laid intellectual foundations that would influence civilizations for millennia. The Greek world became, for a time, one of the most intellectually dynamic regions on Earth. But intellectual dynamism carries structural side effects. The same environment that encouraged open inquiry also intensified internal division. Greek city-states, already politically fragmented, became further strained by competing interests, rival alliances, and ideological tensions. Democratic and oligarchic factions clashed within cities. Poleis competed fiercely for regional influence. Strategic cooperation proved difficult to sustain over long periods. The Peloponnesian War revealed just how fragile the Greek balance had become. What began as a rivalry between Athens and Sparta escalated into a prolonged systemic conflict that exhausted resources, destabilized alliances, and weakened the broader Greek world. The intellectual brilliance of Greece did not disappear, but its political cohesion deteriorated. This juxtaposition is historically revealing. Greece demonstrates that high intellectual development does not automatically produce political stability. In fact, under certain conditions, intense competition, open ideological contestation, and decentralized political energy can amplify fragmentation, if not balanced by durable coordinating structures. Over time, the Greek world entered a phase where internal division made it increasingly vulnerable to external consolidation. When Macedon rose under Philip II and later Alexander, the previously independent Poleis were no longer in a position to maintain collective resistance. The age of the fully autonomous classical city-state began to fade. Yet the legacy of the Greek philosophical explosion did not vanish with political autonomy. If anything, its long-term influence only expanded. Greek thought would travel through Roman institutions, Islamic scholarship, Renaissance humanism, and eventually into the intellectual frameworks of the modern world. In this sense, ancient Greece offers one of history's most fascinating civilizational paradoxes. Its political fragmentation limited its long-term unified power. But its intellectual fragmentation unleashed ideas powerful enough to outlive empires. And this raises a deeper, more unsettling pattern that echoes far beyond the ancient Mediterranean. The societies that think the most deeply about power often become the ones that struggle most to stabilize it. Because once a civilization teaches its people to question everything, including authority itself, the balance between innovation and cohesion becomes permanently delicate. And in that delicate space, both brilliance and fracture can grow side by side. Rome, the machinery of power. If Greece gave the world the language of philosophy, Rome built the most formidable political machine the ancient world had ever seen. Where the Greek city-states thrived on intellectual dynamism but struggled with lasting unity, Rome developed something different, a system optimized for expansion, integration, and long-term control. It was not merely Rome's armies that made it powerful. It was Rome's ability to transform conquest into structure. From its early republican roots, Rome displayed an unusual institutional flexibility. Power was distributed across magistrates, assemblies, and the Senate in ways that allowed the state to adapt during its formative centuries. This balance was imperfect and often contested, but it created a political culture that valued procedure, legal continuity, and administrative coordination. Rome learned early that raw military victory was only the beginning. The true challenge was governing what had been conquered. And here, Rome excelled. As Roman influence expanded across the Mediterranean, the state developed an increasingly sophisticated framework of roads, provincial administration, taxation systems, and legal integration. The famous Roman road network did more than move legions. It moved information, commerce, and authority. Communication across vast distances became faster and more reliable than in any previous empire of comparable size. Governors could be installed, taxes could be collected, rebellions could be detected and suppressed with growing efficiency. This was the emergence of power as machinery. Roman law became one of the empire's most enduring tools. By standardizing legal frameworks across diverse populations, Rome created a shared administrative language that extended far beyond the city itself. Local elites in conquered regions were often incorporated into the Roman system, rather than simply displaced. Citizenship, once tightly restricted, gradually expanded in calculated phases, binding distant populations more closely to the imperial center. This strategy produced extraordinary results. Rome was not merely conquering territory, it was absorbing it. For centuries, the system worked with remarkable effectiveness. Military discipline, bureaucratic organization, infrastructure investment, and legal integration combined to produce one of the most resilient imperial structures in ancient history. The Roman world, at its height, projected an image of unstoppable momentum and structural permanence. But beneath this formidable machinery, subtle pressures were already accumulating. As Rome expanded, its administrative complexity multiplied. Managing distant provinces required layers of bureaucracy. Maintaining frontier security demanded constant military expenditure. Political competition within the elite intensified as the stakes of central power grew higher. What had once been a relatively balanced republican system began to strain under the weight of imperial scale. The late Republic revealed the first major fractures. Elite rivalries escalated into cycles of political violence. Military commanders developed personal loyalty networks that sometimes rivaled the authority of the state itself. Institutional norms that had once moderated competition began to erode. The transition from republic to empire under Augustus stabilized the system in the short term, but it also concentrated unprecedented authority in the imperial office. Centralization restored order, but it also increased systemic dependency on the quality of leadership at the top. Over the long arc of imperial history, Rome demonstrated both the immense strength and the hidden fragility of highly optimized power systems. For centuries, the machinery functioned with impressive resilience. Trade flourished, cities expanded. The Pax Romana created long stretches of relative stability across vast territories. Yet the very efficiency of Rome's system created structural inertia. Administrative costs rose, military commitments expanded, political legitimacy became increasingly tied to imperial performance. When external pressures intensified and internal cohesion weakened in the later centuries of the empire, adaptation became more difficult. This is Rome's most important lesson. Power, when systematized effectively, can scale to astonishing levels. But the more complex and interconnected the machinery becomes, the more carefully it must be maintained. Rome did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. Like many great systems before and after it, it experienced a long, uneven process of strain, adjustment, partial recovery, and gradual fragmentation. To those living within the empire, the system often still appeared functional. even as underlying stresses accumulated. And this is perhaps the most enduring insight Rome offers to the study of civilizations. The strongest empires rarely fall when they appear weakest. At the height of its power, Rome was not held together by conquest alone. Its true strength came from a carefully interlocking system: law, military organization, bureaucracy, and what might be called the psychology of empire. Each element reinforced the others, creating a structure that was both remarkably resilient and, over time, increasingly complex to sustain. Roman law was one of the empire's most sophisticated tools of control and cohesion. Unlike many earlier systems that relied heavily on local custom or sacred authority, Rome developed a legal framework designed for scalability. Laws could be codified, transmitted, and applied across vast and culturally diverse territories. This created a powerful sense of administrative continuity. For merchants, local elites, and provincial populations, Roman law offered predictability, and predictability encouraged cooperation. Disputes could be adjudicated through recognized procedures. Property rights could be enforced. Contracts could be trusted beyond local communities. But Roman law did more than regulate behavior. It quietly reshaped identity. As citizenship gradually expanded, more people across the empire began to see themselves not merely as subjects of Rome, but as participants in a shared legal order. This was a subtle but profound psychological achievement. The empire was not only governing bodies, it was integrating minds. Alongside legal integration stood the Roman military, one of the most disciplined and professional fighting forces of the ancient world. The Roman army was not simply a collection of warriors. It was an institution engineered for endurance. Standardized training, strict hierarchy, logistical planning, and long-term service structures transformed the legions into a highly reliable instrument of state power. Roads built by the military enabled rapid deployment. Frontier fortifications extended the empire's defensive reach. Veterans were often settled in strategic colonies, further embedding Roman influence in newly secured regions. Yet the army also introduced long-term political risk. As Rome expanded, successful generals accumulated enormous personal loyalty from their troops. In the late Republic, this dynamic began to destabilize the traditional balance of power. Armies that were supposed to serve the state increasingly became tied to individual commanders. The system adapted under the empire by placing military authority more firmly under imperial control. But the underlying tension never fully disappeared. Supporting both law and military force was an increasingly elaborate bureaucratic apparatus. Provincial governors, tax collectors, census officials, engineers, and administrative staff formed the quiet infrastructure that allowed Rome to function across continents. Bureaucracy is rarely celebrated in heroic narratives, but without it, Rome's territorial scale would have been impossible to maintain. In its early phases, Roman administration retained a degree of pragmatic flexibility. Local customs were often tolerated. Provincial elites were incorporated into governance structures. Rome understood that excessive rigidity could provoke resistance. But over time, as the empire matured and pressures mounted, the administrative system grew heavier and more complex. Layers of oversight multiplied. Fiscal demands increased. Maintaining cohesion across such a vast structure required ever greater institutional effort. Beneath all of this, law, army, bureaucracy, lay something less visible but equally powerful: the psychology of empire. Rome cultivated an image of inevitability. Through triumphal architecture, public rituals, coinage, and imperial messaging, the state projected a narrative of permanence and universal order. The Pax Romana was not only a geopolitical reality, it was a psychological environment. Many within the empire came to believe that Roman order was simply the natural state of the world. This belief was one of Rome's greatest strategic assets. When populations internalize the legitimacy and durability of a system, overt coercion becomes less necessary. Compliance becomes normalized. Resistance appears not only dangerous, but futile. Yet here again, the familiar historical tension emerges. The more successful an imperial system becomes at projecting permanence, the more difficult it can be to recognize early signals of structural strain. Rising military costs, administrative overextension, economic pressures, and political fragmentation do not immediately shatter the illusion of stability. Often, the machinery continues to function outwardly long after deeper stresses have begun to accumulate. Rome's power system was, in many respects, one of the most sophisticated ever constructed in the ancient world. It integrated law, force, administration, and psychology with extraordinary effectiveness. But it also demonstrated a recurring civilizational truth. Rome did not fall because it was weak. In many ways, Rome became the victim of the very strengths that had once made it unstoppable. At its height, the empire possessed unmatched military reach, sophisticated legal integration, vast infrastructure networks, and a deeply internalized imperial identity. For centuries, this system functioned with remarkable effectiveness. Expansion generated wealth. Wealth funded the army. The army secured the borders. The borders protected the economy. It was a powerful feedback loop, but systems built for continuous success often struggle when the environment begins to change. Rome's early expansion had been fueled by flexibility, political, military, and administrative. The Republic adapted quickly. Institutions evolved under pressure. Local elites were incorporated rather than simply crushed. But as the empire grew larger and more complex, success gradually hardened into structure. What had once been adaptive mechanisms became entrenched habits. And habits, when scaled across continents, are notoriously difficult to reform. One of Rome's greatest strengths, territorial expansion, quietly transformed into one of its heaviest burdens. Vast frontiers required constant military presence. Garrisons stretched from Britain to the Near East. Logistics became increasingly expensive. Each new conquest added not only wealth, but also long-term administrative and defensive obligations. Over time, the cost of maintaining the empire began to rise faster than the benefits of expanding it. At the same time, political centralization, which had stabilized Rome after the chaos of the late Republic, introduced a new form of vulnerability. Imperial authority became heavily concentrated in the figure of the emperor. Strong rulers could hold the system together with impressive efficiency, but weak, short-lived, or contested leadership at the top could ripple instability throughout the entire structure. The empire had traded some of its early flexibility for centralized coherence, and that trade-off grew more consequential with each passing century. Economic pressures compounded the strain. Military expenditures rose. Administrative costs multiplied. Currency debasement and taxation pressures increased in various periods. While the empire remained enormously wealthy in absolute terms, the balance between income and structural obligation became more delicate. Large systems rarely collapse because they are suddenly poor. They struggle when their cost of stability becomes progressively harder to sustain. Yet perhaps the most subtle factor was psychological. For generations, Romans had internalized the idea of imperial permanence. The Pax Romana had lasted so long that stability itself began to feel natural, almost guaranteed. When warning signs appeared, frontier pressure, political turbulence, fiscal strain, they often emerged gradually rather than catastrophically. The machinery still functioned, cities still prospered, trade still moved. To many living within the system, the empire still looked strong. And this is where Rome's deepest vulnerability emerged. because the most dangerous phase for a complex power system is often not visible collapse. It is slow systemic overextension combined with institutional rigidity. Rome's administrative and military networks had become extraordinarily sophisticated, but also increasingly heavy to maintain. Adaptation became slower. Structural reforms became politically difficult. Regional pressures accumulated unevenly across the empire. By the time the Western Roman Empire entered its final centuries of fragmentation, the system was not simply failing in one place. It was straining across multiple fronts simultaneously: military, fiscal, administrative, and political. No single blow ended Rome. Instead, it experienced what many large systems do: a long, uneven process of degradation masked by periods of apparent recovery. This is the paradox at the heart of Rome's story. Its military success created vast obligations. Its administrative sophistication created structural weight. Its political centralization created leadership dependency, and its long stability created psychological overconfidence. Rome was not destroyed by one enemy or one mistake. It was gradually overtaken by the accumulated cost of maintaining the very system that had once made it dominant. And in that sense, Rome leaves behind one of history's most enduring warnings. The greatest powers rarely collapse because they are suddenly weak, but because they become too optimized for the world that made them strong, and too slow to adapt when that world begins to change. The pattern of collapse. When we step back from the details of individual civilizations, from the river cities of Mesopotamia to the ordered kingdoms of Egypt, from the restless brilliance of Greece to the vast machinery of Rome, a striking pattern begins to emerge. Despite their differences in geography, culture, and political structure, many complex societies follow a surprisingly similar trajectory. Civilizations rarely collapse in sudden, dramatic moments of visible weakness. More often, they begin to erode while still appearing strong. This is the pattern of collapse. It usually begins not with failure, but with success. Periods of expansion, stability, and prosperity create confidence. Systems that function well over long stretches of time gradually become institutionalized. Procedures harden, hierarchies solidify. The very mechanisms that once enabled growth become optimized for preservation rather than adaptation. At first, this shift is almost invisible. Administrative systems grow more complex. Military commitments expand incrementally. Economic networks become more interconnected and more fragile. Elites, benefiting from the existing order, become increasingly invested in maintaining continuity. From the inside, the civilization still appears stable, often impressively so. But beneath the surface, pressures begin to accumulate. One of the earliest signals is what might be called elite insulation. Decision-makers at the center of power gradually become more removed from the conditions at the periphery. Information travels upward through bureaucratic filters. Local problems appear smaller or more temporary than they really are. Over time, the feedback loop that once allowed rapid adaptation begins to slow. At the same time, institutional rigidity tends to increase. Systems designed during earlier phases of expansion become harder to reform. Legal frameworks multiply. Administrative layers thicken. Military structures grow more expensive to maintain. Each component of the system still functions, but the cost of coordination rises steadily. Another recurring feature is the normalization of strain. Populations and leaders alike adapt psychologically to mounting pressure. Economic difficulties become routine. Frontier conflicts become expected. Political tensions become familiar background noise. Because the system does not fail all at once, the sense of urgency remains muted. Humans are remarkably good at adjusting to gradual change. even when that change signals long-term structural risk. Meanwhile, external pressures often intensify precisely when internal flexibility is declining. Trade disruptions, environmental shifts, migrating populations, or rival powers begin to test the system's resilience. At earlier stages of growth, many civilizations could absorb such shocks, but in the later phases of systemic maturity, the margin for error becomes thinner. What makes the pattern so deceptive is that collapse rarely looks like collapse while it is happening. Cities remain populated, markets continue operating, armies still march. Official rhetoric often emphasizes continuity and strength. Even during late imperial periods, many people living within these systems do not experience daily life as immediate catastrophe. The structure does not shatter overnight. It stretches, strains, partially recovers, and then strains again. Eventually, however, the cumulative weight becomes too great. A fiscal crisis here, a military overstretch there, a succession conflict, a regional fragmentation. No single event ends the system. Instead, multiple stress points begin to interact. What was once a tightly coordinated machine becomes uneven. Peripheral regions drift. Central authority weakens. Administrative coherence declines. And what had long been maintained through momentum begins to lose its structural balance. This is the final phase of the pattern. Not sudden collapse, but systemic unraveling. The most important lesson is also the most unsettling. Civilizations rarely fail because their people are unaware of problems. They fail because large systems make rapid, coordinated adaptation extremely difficult once complexity reaches a certain threshold. Mesopotamia showed how early urban complexity created cycles of strain. Egypt demonstrated the long-term risks of stability-rigidity. Greece revealed the tension between intellectual dynamism and political fragmentation. Rome exposed the hidden cost of highly optimized imperial machinery. Different paths, different cultures, but beneath them all, the same quiet pattern. And perhaps the most sobering insight is this. The pattern of collapse is not a relic of the ancient world. It is a structural tendency that emerges whenever human systems grow large, interconnected, and deeply invested in their own continuity. Which means the most important question history leaves us with is not why past civilizations declined, but whether any complex. One of the most consistent warning signs in the life cycle of complex civilizations is the gradual separation between elites and reality. In the early phases of expansion, leadership structures are often closely tied to material conditions on the ground. Decision makers face immediate constraints. Failures are visible. Feedback arrives quickly. Under these conditions, adaptation tends to be faster and more pragmatic, but success changes the environment. As a civilization grows wealthier, more administratively layered, and more geographically expansive, the ruling class often becomes increasingly insulated from the daily pressures experienced by the broader population. Information begins to move through longer bureaucratic chains. Advisors filter what reaches the center. Institutional culture starts to reward stability and continuity rather than uncomfortable warnings. This process is rarely intentional. It is structural. Over time, elites begin to operate inside a carefully maintained informational environment, one that reflects how the system is supposed to function, not always how it is actually functioning. Local crises are framed as temporary disturbances. Economic strain is interpreted as cyclical. Frontier instability is treated as manageable. Because the core machinery still appears intact, the overall system continues to project confidence. This is the moment when perception begins to diverge from reality. History shows that many advanced societies do not collapse because their leaders see the danger clearly and choose to ignore it. They struggle because the complexity of the system makes accurate situational awareness increasingly difficult at the highest levels of power. The larger and more sophisticated the administrative network becomes, the more layers information must pass through before reaching those who make strategic decisions. At the same time, institutional rigidity tends to increase. Systems that have operated successfully for long periods naturally develop procedures designed to preserve what works. Laws multiply, administrative offices expand, military commitments become structurally embedded, economic arrangements harden into expectation. Each layer of stability makes the system more predictable in the short term, but also less flexible in the long term. What once enabled coordination begins to slow adaptation. Reforms become politically expensive. Structural changes threaten established interests. Bureaucracies designed originally to manage complexity begin to prioritize procedural continuity over rapid response. Even when warning signs become visible at the periphery, the center often responds incrementally rather than decisively. This dynamic creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more elites rely on the apparent stability of the system, the more the system's internal inertia grows. And the more rigid the system becomes, the harder it is to implement the kind of structural adjustments that earlier, more flexible phases of the civilization handled with relative ease. Importantly, this phase rarely feels like imminent collapse to those living within it. Cities remain active, institutions continue operating, revenue still flows, military forces remain formidable. From the inside, the system often still appears strong, sometimes even at its peak of outward sophistication. This is precisely what makes the pattern so historically persistent and so difficult to interrupt. Because by the time the gap between elite perception and structural reality becomes unmistakable, the cost of rapid adaptation is often extremely high. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the details differ, but the underlying mechanism appears again and again. As complexity rises, elites tend to become more informationally distant. As stability persists, systems tend to harden. And once rigidity reaches a certain threshold, even relatively manageable shocks can begin to propagate more widely through the structure. This is not the moment of collapse itself. It is the phase when the system becomes quietly vulnerable to shocks it once could have absorbed. And in the long arc of history, civilizations rarely fail because they were always fragile. They fail because the very success that made them strong gradually made them less able to see and less able to adapt when the environment around them began to change. History rarely ends with the sound of a single collapse. Empires do not usually vanish in one dramatic night, nor do civilizations suddenly wake to find their world gone. More often, decline unfolds quietly, through small adjustments, delayed responses, and systems that continue to function just well enough to postpone alarm. Mesopotamia showed us the birth of complexity. Egypt revealed the power and risk of stability. Greece ignited the fire of questioning thought. Rome perfected the machinery of organized power. Different cultures, different geographies, different destinies, and yet, beneath them all, the same structural tension continued to surface. Civilizations rise when they are adaptive, flexible, and closely connected to reality. They begin to strain when success hardens into assumption. And they become vulnerable when systems grow so confident in their own stability that they stop noticing the cost of maintaining it. What makes this pattern so unsettling is not that past empires failed. It is how familiar the pattern remains. Large systems still expand. Institutions still harden. Elites can still become insulated, and populations, more often than not, continue living their daily lives while structural pressures quietly accumulate beneath the surface. History does not repeat in perfect detail, but it does repeat in recognizable rhythms. The lesson of the ancient world is not that collapse is inevitable. Civilizations are remarkably resilient. They adapt, reform, and recover more often than they disappear. But resilience has limits, and complexity always carries a price. The more interconnected and optimized a system becomes, the more carefully it must balance stability with flexibility, confidence with awareness, and power with adaptability. Because in the end, the most dangerous moment for any civilization is not when it appears weak, but when it appears unshakably strong. If this journey through the hidden mechanics of ancient civilizations made you see history differently, subscribe to the Enigmatic Veil for more deep historical and psychological explorations. Until next time, stay curious and look beyond the surface. For centuries, Rome has been remembered as the ultimate symbol of power, discipline, and civilization. When people speak of the ancient world, they often speak of Rome with a kind of quiet admiration. The empire of marble forums, unstoppable legions, and laws that would shape the foundations of the modern world. We are taught to respect its engineering, to study its military brilliance, and to view its expansion as the natural rise of an extraordinary civilization. But history, as always, tells two stories. One is carved in stone and repeated in textbooks. The other lives in the shadows, quieter, darker, and far more uncomfortable. Because behind the shining image of Roman greatness stood a society that normalized brutality with chilling efficiency. This was not merely an empire that conquered land. It was an empire that mastered the psychology of control. In Rome, death could become public entertainment. Mercy could be interpreted as weakness. And obedience, absolute, unquestioned obedience, was often valued more than human life itself. The Roman system did not emerge by accident. It was built deliberately, layer by layer, through culture, politics, and fear. The arenas, the triumphs, the punishments, the spectacles, all of them served a purpose far beyond what appeared on the surface. They trained the population. They shaped behavior. They taught millions of people what power looked like and what happened to those who stood against it. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: when Rome finally fell, many of its darkest psychological mechanisms did not vanish with it. They adapted. They resurfaced. They quietly embedded themselves into later systems of power across history, which forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. When we admire Rome, what exactly are we admiring? The architecture, the order, the strength, or the system that proved how far a civilization could go when efficiency began to outweigh empathy? Tonight, we are not looking at the Rome of polished legends and heroic myths. We are looking beneath the marble surface into the mindset that helped build one of the most formidable empires the world has ever seen. Because to truly understand Rome's rise, we must confront the darker traits that made such power possible in the first place. Fact 1. When death became entertainment. One of the darkest traits of Roman society was not simply that violence existed, but that it was celebrated, organized, and turned into mass entertainment. In the heart of Rome, thousands of citizens would gather inside massive arenas like the Colosseum, not to witness sport as we understand it today, but to watch men fight, bleed, and often die for public amusement. These were the gladiatorial games, and they were not rare events. They were frequent state-sponsored spectacles designed to captivate the population. Gladiators were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, trained to fight in brutal conditions where survival depended on skill, endurance, and sometimes pure luck. But what makes this truly unsettling is not only the violence itself, it is the emotional normalization that surrounded it. Crowds cheered, senators attended, emperors used the games to gain popularity. Over time, repeated exposure to public killing began to reshape what society considered acceptable. Violence became ritualized, death became theatrical, and empathy, slowly but surely, was pushed further into the background. The arena was more than entertainment. It was psychological conditioning. It reminded the population who held power. It demonstrated the consequences of weakness. And it transformed human suffering into a shared public experience. This does not mean every Roman was cruel, nor that the entire civilization can be reduced to bloodlust. But the cultural acceptance of gladiatorial death reveals something deeply important about the Roman mindset. When a society repeatedly consumes violence as spectacle, the line between necessity and cruelty begins to blur, and in Rome, that line was often almost invisible. Fact 2, when individual life meant little. Another deeply troubling trait within Roman society was the quiet but powerful devaluation of individual human life when it conflicted with the needs of the state. Rome was built on discipline, order, and collective strength, and while these qualities helped create a remarkably efficient empire, they often came at a human cost that is easy to overlook from a distance. In Roman culture, the ideal citizen was expected to place duty above personal emotion, loyalty above compassion, and obedience above individual survival. Soldiers were trained to hold formation even when it meant near certain death. Commanders were praised for sacrificing thousands if it secured victory. And in times of crisis, harsh punishments such as decimation, the execution of one soldier in every 10, were used to enforce absolute discipline within the legions. To the Roman strategic mind, this was not necessarily cruelty for its own sake. It was viewed as necessary maintenance of order. But psychologically, the message was unmistakable. The individual existed to serve the system, not the other way around. Over generations, this mindset helped create one of the most formidable military machines in history, yet it also normalized a dangerous moral trade-off. Efficiency began to outweigh empathy. Stability began to justify severity, and the value of a single human life became increasingly conditional. This cultural conditioning did not mean Romans lacked personal bonds or private compassion. Many clearly did. But at the structural level of power, the system consistently rewarded those who could suppress individual sentiment in favor of collective control. It is here that we begin to see one of Rome's most enduring psychological legacies. When a civilization becomes powerful enough, it often starts to measure human worth not by humanity, but by usefulness. And once that shift begins, it rarely stops at the battlefield. Fact 3, collective punishment mentality. One of the most chilling features of Roman power was its systematic use of collective punishment as a tool of control. Rome did not always limit consequences to the individual who resisted authority. Entire groups could suffer for the actions of a few. Rebellious cities were sometimes destroyed, their populations enslaved or executed to send a message that resistance would carry unbearable costs. Within the military itself, the practice of decimation demonstrated this mindset with brutal clarity. When a unit showed cowardice or disobedience, one soldier out of every 10 could be randomly selected and executed by his own comrades. The psychological impact of such policies was profound. Fear did not remain personal, it became communal. Responsibility became shared, whether fairly or not. This created an environment where people were pressured to police one another because the failure of one could endanger many. From the Roman perspective, this reinforced discipline and discouraged rebellion. But it also reveals a darker truth about the empire's governing philosophy. Stability was often maintained not through trust, but through carefully engineered fear that spread across entire populations. Fact 4, ruthless expansionism. Rome's rise was not a slow accident of geography. It was driven by an almost relentless momentum of expansion. Roman leadership and culture gradually developed an expectation that growth was both natural and necessary. Each successful campaign fed the next. Each victory normalized further conquest. Over time, expansion became embedded not only in military policy but in Roman identity itself. New territories brought wealth, slaves, and prestige, reinforcing the belief that Rome's dominance was both justified and inevitable. Yet this constant outward pressure carried a psychological cost. An empire built on perpetual expansion must continuously define new threats and new frontiers. Peace in such a system can begin to feel unnatural or even dangerous. While Rome often integrated conquered peoples with remarkable administrative skill, the underlying engine remained uncompromising. Resistance would be crushed, and strategic advantage would outweigh local suffering. This relentless drive helped build one of history's greatest empires. But it also normalized a worldview in which force became the default solution to uncertainty. Fact 5. Political betrayal as a norm. Another disturbing trait that quietly shaped Roman power was the normalization of political betrayal at the highest levels of leadership. Rome projected an image of order, law, and structured governance, yet beneath that polished surface operated a political environment that could be intensely unforgiving. Ambition in Rome was not merely encouraged. It was often essential for survival within elite circles. Senators, generals, and rising political figures constantly navigated a landscape where alliances were temporary and trust was fragile. The late Republic in particular became a stage where personal loyalty frequently collided with political necessity. Deals were made behind closed doors, promises were quietly broken, and rivals were sometimes removed through exile, public disgrace, or assassination. What makes this especially significant is not simply that betrayal occurred, such things have existed in many societies, but that Roman political culture gradually absorbed it as an expected risk of pursuing power. Over time, this created an atmosphere of permanent strategic tension. Leaders learned to anticipate treachery, supporters learned to hedge their loyalties, and the system itself began rewarding those who could maneuver most coldly through this environment of calculated distrust. This did not mean Rome lacked capable or principled figures. Many leaders genuinely believed they were acting in the republic's or empire's best interest. But structurally, the political arena increasingly favored those willing to prioritize advantage over attachment. In the long run, this normalization of elite rivalry and suspicion would contribute to cycles of instability that even Rome's formidable institutions struggled to contain. Fact 6. Dehumanization of enemies. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean world, it developed a powerful psychological habit that many large empires eventually adopt: the gradual dehumanization of external enemies. Roman military success depended not only on discipline and engineering, but also on the ability to maintain emotional distance from those they fought. In official rhetoric, conquered peoples were often framed primarily as threats to order, obstacles to stability, or subjects to be pacified. This framing made sustained military campaigns psychologically easier to justify to both soldiers and civilians. Once an opponent is viewed less as a community of individuals and more as a problem to be solved, the moral barriers to harsh action begin to weaken. Roman commanders could be pragmatic administrators after conquest, and in many cases, Rome integrated defeated populations with notable sophistication. However, during active resistance, the empire could respond with overwhelming severity, designed to deter future uprisings. The deeper issue here is psychological conditioning. Over generations, repeated exposure to narratives of Roman superiority and external barbarism helped reinforce an us versus them worldview. Such thinking is not unique to Rome, but within the Roman system, it became a highly effective tool of expansion. It allowed ordinary citizens to support distant wars and helped soldiers maintain cohesion under extreme conditions. Yet it also illustrates a recurring pattern in powerful states. When enemies are consistently framed as less fully human, the range of acceptable actions quietly expands. Fact 7. Obsession with power and glory. Roman culture placed enormous symbolic weight on honor, reputation, and public recognition, particularly among the elite. Military triumphs, public monuments, and political advancement were deeply intertwined with personal legacy. For ambitious Romans, especially within the upper classes, achieving lasting glory was not simply vanity. It was a central measure of success. Victorious generals celebrated triumphs through the streets of Rome, their achievements immortalized in stone inscriptions and public memory. This cultural emphasis created powerful incentives. Success in war or politics could elevate a family's status for generations. Failure, however, could mean obscurity or disgrace. Over time, the pursuit of glory became woven into the competitive fabric of Roman leadership. Many decisions were undoubtedly strategic and carefully calculated, yet the cultural reward structure consistently elevated bold, visible success. The psychological danger in such a system is subtle but important. When prestige and survival become tightly linked, leaders may feel increasing pressure to pursue decisive victories rather than cautious restraint. Rome's expansion benefited enormously from this drive, but it also contributed to internal rivalries and escalating ambitions that the Republican system eventually struggled to balance. The Roman world admired strength, but that admiration sometimes pushed its leaders toward ever greater risks. Fact 8. Public fear as a control tool. Rome understood something that many later states would rediscover. Fear, when carefully managed, can be a remarkably efficient instrument of governance. The empire did not rely on terror alone. It also used law, infrastructure, and incentives, but visible punishment played a clear role in maintaining order. Crucifixions along major roads, harsh military discipline, and highly publicized consequences for rebellion all served as powerful deterrents. These actions were rarely random. They were meant to be seen. The psychological message was direct and widely understood. Order would be preserved, and challenges to authority would carry severe consequences. From a purely administrative perspective, such measures could produce stability across vast territories with relatively limited manpower. Yet the long-term cultural effect is more complex. When populations repeatedly witness extreme punishment as a normal function of authority, fear can become embedded in the social environment. Compliance increases, but so can quiet resentment beneath the surface. Rome managed this balance for centuries with remarkable skill, but the reliance on visible severity reveals an important aspect of imperial psychology. Power was not only exercised, it was carefully performed. Fact 9. Social hierarchy extremes. Roman society was highly structured, and while this organization contributed to administrative efficiency, it also produced stark social divisions. Status in Rome carried enormous legal and economic consequences. Patricians, equestrians, plebeians, freedmen, and slaves occupied clearly defined positions within the social order. Mobility was possible in some cases, but the hierarchy remained deeply influential in daily life. Slavery in particular formed a foundational component of the Roman economy, supplying labor across agriculture, households, mines, and large estates. Many Romans likely viewed this system as a normal feature of the ancient world, and in many ways it was. But its scale and integration into Roman prosperity cannot be ignored. The psychological effect of such rigid stratification is significant. When large populations grow accustomed to sharp inequalities, social expectations begin to harden around them. Privilege can feel natural to those who benefit from it, while subordination can become normalized among those born into it. Rome's hierarchy helped maintain order across a massive empire, yet it also institutionalized a worldview in which human value was often closely tied to status and function. Fact 10. Normalization of violence. Perhaps the most profound and far-reaching trait underlying Roman power was the gradual normalization of violence across multiple layers of society. This did not mean Rome was uniquely violent compared to every other ancient civilization. The ancient world as a whole was harsh, but Rome's scale, organization, and cultural reinforcement of force gave violence a particularly structured role. Military conquest, public executions, gladiatorial games, and harsh disciplinary systems all existed within a broader cultural framework that treated force as an expected instrument of order. Over time, repeated exposure can change perception. What once shocks can begin to feel routine. What once feels extreme can slowly become acceptable under the right conditions. Rome's success depended heavily on its ability to apply force decisively and consistently, and in many ways this effectiveness became part of its identity. Yet the deeper lesson is psychological rather than purely historical. When any powerful system repeatedly rewards outcomes achieved through controlled violence, societies can gradually adjust their moral thresholds without fully noticing the shift. Rome mastered this balance for centuries, but the very mechanisms that made it formidable also reveal the uncomfortable truth at the heart of many great powers. Strength, when left unchecked by restraint, has a tendency to redefine what a civilization is willing to tolerate. Fact 7. Obsession with power and glory. Roman culture placed enormous symbolic weight on honor, reputation, and public recognition, particularly among the elite. Military triumphs, public monuments, and political advancement were deeply intertwined with personal legacy. For ambitious Romans, especially within the upper classes, achieving lasting glory was not simply vanity. It was a central measure of success. Victorious generals celebrated triumphs through the streets of Rome, their achievements immortalized in stone inscriptions and public memory. This cultural emphasis created powerful incentives. Success in war or politics could elevate a family's status for generations. Failure, however, could mean obscurity or disgrace. Over time, the pursuit of glory became woven into the competitive fabric of Roman leadership. Many decisions were undoubtedly strategic and carefully calculated, yet the cultural reward structure consistently elevated bold, visible success. The psychological danger in such a system is subtle but important. When prestige and survival become tightly linked, leaders may feel increasing pressure to pursue decisive victories rather than cautious restraint. Rome's expansion benefited enormously from this drive, but it also contributed to internal rivalries and escalating ambitions that the Republican system eventually struggled to balance. The Roman world admired strength, but that admiration sometimes pushed its leaders toward ever greater risks. Fact 8. Public fear as a control tool. Rome understood something that many later states would rediscover. Fear, when carefully managed, can be a remarkably efficient instrument of governance. The empire did not rely on terror alone. It also used law, infrastructure, and incentives, but visible punishment played a clear role in maintaining order. Crucifixions along major roads, harsh military discipline, and highly publicized consequences for rebellion all served as powerful deterrents. These actions were rarely random. They were meant to be seen. The psychological message was direct and widely understood. Order would be preserved and challenges to authority would carry severe consequences. From a purely administrative perspective, such measures could produce stability across vast territories with relatively limited manpower. Yet the long-term cultural effect is more complex. When populations repeatedly witness extreme punishment as a normal function of authority, fear can become embedded in the social environment. Compliance increases, but so can quiet resentment beneath the surface. Rome managed this balance for centuries with remarkable skill, but the reliance on visible severity reveals an important aspect of imperial psychology. Power was not only exercised, it was carefully performed. Fact 5. Political betrayal as a norm. Another disturbing trait that quietly shaped Roman power was the normalization of political betrayal at the highest levels of leadership. Rome projected an image of order, law, and structured governance, yet beneath that polished surface operated a political environment that could be intensely unforgiving. Ambition in Rome was not merely encouraged. It was often essential for survival within elite circles. Senators, generals, and rising political figures constantly navigated a landscape where alliances were temporary and trust was fragile. The late Republic in particular became a stage where personal loyalty frequently collided with political necessity. Deals were made behind closed doors, promises were quietly broken, and rivals were sometimes removed through exile, public disgrace, or assassination. What makes this especially significant is not simply that betrayal occurred, such things have existed in many societies, but that Roman political culture gradually absorbed it as an expected risk of pursuing power. Over time, this created an atmosphere of permanent strategic tension. Leaders learned to anticipate treachery, supporters learned to hedge their loyalties, and the system itself began rewarding those who could maneuver most coldly through this environment of calculated distrust. This did not mean Rome lacked capable or principled figures. Many leaders genuinely believed they were acting in the republic's or empire's best interest. But structurally, the political arena increasingly favored those willing to prioritize advantage over attachment. In the long run, this normalization of elite rivalry and suspicion would contribute to cycles of instability that even Rome's formidable institutions struggled to contain. Fact 4. Ruthless expansionism. Rome's rise was not a slow accident of geography. It was driven by an almost relentless momentum of expansion. Roman leadership and culture gradually developed an expectation that growth was both natural and necessary. Each successful campaign fed the next. Each victory normalized further conquest. Over time, expansion became embedded not only in military policy but in Roman identity itself. New territories brought wealth, slaves, and prestige, reinforcing the belief that Rome's dominance was both justified and inevitable. Yet this constant outward pressure carried a psychological cost. An empire built on perpetual expansion must continuously define new threats and new frontiers. Peace in such a system can begin to feel unnatural or even dangerous. While Rome often integrated conquered peoples with remarkable administrative skill, the underlying engine remained uncompromising. Resistance would be crushed, and strategic advantage would outweigh local suffering. This relentless drive helped build one of history's greatest empires. But it also normalized a worldview in which force became the default solution to uncertainty. Fact 1. When death became entertainment. One of the darkest traits of Roman society was not simply that violence existed, but that it was celebrated, organized, and turned into mass entertainment. In the heart of Rome, thousands of citizens would gather inside massive arenas like the Colosseum, not to witness sport as we understand it today, but to watch men fight, bleed, and often die for public amusement. These were the gladiatorial games, and they were not rare events. They were frequent state-sponsored spectacles designed to captivate the population. Gladiators were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, trained to fight in brutal conditions where survival depended on skill, endurance, and sometimes pure luck. But what makes this truly unsettling is not only the violence itself, it is the emotional normalization that surrounded it. Crowds cheered, senators attended, emperors used the games to gain popularity. Over time, repeated exposure to public killing began to reshape what society considered acceptable. Violence became ritualized, death became theatrical, and empathy, slowly but surely, was pushed further into the background. The arena was more than entertainment. It was psychological conditioning. It reminded the population who held power. It demonstrated the consequences of weakness. And it transformed human suffering into a shared public experience. This does not mean every Roman was cruel, nor that the entire civilization can be reduced to bloodlust. But the cultural acceptance of gladiatorial death reveals something deeply important about the Roman mindset. When a society repeatedly consumes violence as spectacle, the line between necessity and cruelty begins to blur, and in Rome, that line was often almost invisible.